Chapter 11 Alpha King found her. Cassandra. When I awoke, my vision was blurred, and my head swam with incoherent thoughts. As I fought back the dizziness, my eyes began to adjust, and images of the moon goddess and the holy moon appeared. For a moment, I stared at them and wondered if this was the afterlife. Had the bear managed to take my life? Was I dead? Suddenly, the room came into focus, and I recognized the mural I'd painted on my ceiling long ago. I wasn't dead. I was in my bedroom, tucked tightly into bed. How had I gotten here? Suddenly, I felt the soft touch of a warm hand on my arm. When I glanced over, I caught sight of Marley. "Oh, Cassandra," she gushed in pure relief, and her pale green eyes glittered with tears. "You're awake." It took me a moment to register everything. I blinked a few times and then I smiled up at my dear friend. Hi, I'm Marley. The effort of speaking hurt my throat, but I was so relieved to see her that it didn't matter. I was so worried, Cass, Marley continued on, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. So extremely worried. She then took my hand in hers. "I'm sorry to scare you," I managed to say. I wanted to comfort her further, but when I attempted to squeeze her hand, a sharp pain shot through my entire body. When I winced, she pulled her hand away quickly. "Oh, Cass," Marley uttered, and her eyes widened. "I'm so sorry, that must have hurt." It's okay," I said through the pain, and then a thought crossed my mind. Where was my Finnick? I glanced around the room, but my son was nowhere to be found. Panic flooded through me, and my heart rate increased exponentially. Had he made it out of that cave? And how had I ended up here anyway? "Marley, where's Finnick?" I asked, and my lower lip trembled as I choked out the words. "What's going on? Is he all right? And how did I get here in the first place?" "Hey, take a breath," Marley urged, and her expression grew serious. "Finnick is perfectly safe. He's back at the pack house with the Alpha and Luna. They're taking good care of him." "Is he hurt?" I stammered, and my vision grew cloudy with tears as memories of the bear and the cave crashed over me. But Marley shook her head. "Finnick is perfectly fine. He's a little bruised, but that's it. Now, I'm serious, take a deep breath. Doctor's orders. You're in pretty rough shape and I don't want you to hurt yourself further." It took a moment for the information to sink in, and when it did, I heeded my friend's advice and took a long, deep breath. A few minutes later, when I was in a calmer state, another thought crossed my mind. Who saved me from the bear? I wondered, and my eyebrows creased together. And how did I get back here in the first place? A strange look crossed Marley's face. "The Alpha from Anamon brought you here," she replied with a roll of her eyes, and she let out a small sigh. "He was the one who found you out in the woods." I gasped in surprise. Asher Collins had found me. It made a little sense, I supposed. Before I'd lost consciousness, the last face I remembered seeing was Asher's. Is it possible I hadn't hallucinated after all? "The Alpha found me," I repeated back quietly. I attempted to sit up, but the effort sent another pang of pain through my chest, so I laid back down. Wow. It was definitely a surprise to get a call from him in the middle of the night, Marley remarked. When he explained the situation to me, he sounded like he was going to bite my head off or something. I frowned in confusion. "What do you mean?" Marley sighed again, and she sat down on the chair beside me. "Well, he was extremely angry. He was super short-tempered with me and ordered me to get to the clinic to help. I totally understand the urgency, and I would have rushed there in a second anyway to help you, but he was intense, to say the least. That being said, what he did really changed my opinion of him." "Really?" I asked in surprise, and she nodded. "When he arrived at the clinic, he was so gentle with you," she explained. "You were passed out cold, and he handled you so carefully. He helped me get you down on the table and made sure you were comfortable as I started treating you." "Wow," I uttered. "Right," Marley agreed, and she shook her head slowly. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. He could have sent a guard to handle the whole thing, but he wouldn't let anyone else into the clinic the entire time I was taking care of your injuries. Then he carried you himself all the way here to your house." "That's surprising," I remarked. Asher Collins had personally escorted me back to my house. For a moment, I felt strange about the idea of the Alpha King being in my small house, but the other part of me was grateful that he'd intervened and helped Marley get me home safe. That meant more to me than I could express, even if the idea of it all was so strange. Definitely, Marley said. We made sure you were comfortable, and then he left for the pack house. It was so strange, Cassandra. It was like he was a completely different person than he'd been when we were taking care of his son. That's definitely strange, I said. When I tried to readjust myself in bed, my shoulder cried out in pain, and I let out a soft cry. Marley immediately reached out and supported me. You have to be careful, she urged. You're going to stress your body out if you keep moving around. Tears welled up in my eyes as I suddenly became aware of the rest of the pain. It was there in my abdomen, my arm, my head. I was a wreck. So, how bad is it? I wondered even though I was scared of the answer. I'm not gonna lie, it's not great, Marley replied, and she gave me an apologetic look. The bear's claws scratched your stomach up pretty badly, and your shoulder is sprained. My eyes widened. Relax, my friend insisted. You're going to be just fine. It's just gonna take some time to heal. Now, I'm gonna take a look at your stomach and make sure nothing is bleeding, okay? Okay, I agreed. Marley carefully shifted the covers away from me and got to work immediately. She gently checked my bandages, and after a minute or so, she pulled the blanket back over me. Looks good, she said, and after she smiled at me, the expression faded, and she stared deeply into my eyes. Cass, I just have to ask. Why were you out in the forest with Finnick to begin with? Especially that late at night. What was going on? My heart stopped in my chest, and I gulped quietly. I'd assumed Marley had read the letter I'd left her, but evidently, she hadn't. When I hesitated to find an answer, Marley's eyes narrowed. I can tell you're about to lie to me, she said. Please don't. I want to know what happened, Cassie. It must have been serious if you'd brought Finnick out there with you. Please just tell me. I won't tell anyone else, I swear. I wanted to lie, but Marley was my best friend. I couldn't reveal all of the details of my past, but I had to tell her this. The Alpha King ordered me to come with him to Anamond, I revealed. He told me I had 2 days and then I was supposed to come with him. Marley was shocked. That dog, she cursed under her breath. I take back everything I said. He's a terrible person. How dare he try to uproot your entire life like that? After the words left her lips, we fell into silence. We could curse him all we wanted, but we both knew his order was law. I could only imagine what he would do now that I'd tried to leave. But that was something I could worry about later. For now, my only concern was Finnick. My eyes flew toward the window. The sun hadn't risen from the horizon yet. It was earlier than I'd thought. I have to pick Finnick up, I remarked. He's probably scared and worried sick. You'll do no such thing, Marley replied in a serious voice. You're too weak to go anywhere. Finnick is safe. You need to worry about yourself and get some rest. She picked a bottle of medicine off of my nightstand and opened the container. She retrieved a pair of pills. Painkillers, I assumed. Take these, she urged, and she carefully helped me get them down. After I swallowed, she gave me some water and then pulled the blanket up further. But what about? I started to say, but Marley cut me off. Finnick will see you later, she said. Now, try to get some sleep. When you wake up, I'll accompany you to the pack house. Chapter 12 Alpha's Meeting. Cassandra. I tried to protest Marley's proposal, but I knew it was a losing battle. I needed to get some rest so I could be strong enough to see Finnick. Even though he was with Alpha Garrett's family, my poor boy was probably terrified and worried about me. And I was worried about him. But I couldn't deny that I needed rest. So, I laid back in bed. Marley told me she'd be downstairs and she'd check on me in a little while, and then she quietly left the room. Once she was gone, I took a long deep breath and tried to process everything she'd told me. Asher Collins had saved my life. I closed my eyes after a while and tried to get some rest. Luckily, the medicine Marley had given me was highly effective, and I drifted off quickly, but my sleep was anything but peaceful. My dreams were plagued with images and nightmares of the inferno, along with scenarios of losing my Finnick all because Asher had exposed my real identity. The dreams were strange and twisted, and when I awoke, I was drenched in sweat. Golden sunlight streamed through the window. I'd been asleep for hours. I managed to carefully sit up without causing myself too much pain, and after I took a long, deep breath, I raised my arm to brush my hair from my forehead. The effort was painful, but it was a relief to get some cold air on my face. "Marley," I called out, and my throat strained a little at the effort. The door opened moments later, and Marley entered the room. "Oh good, you're awake," my friend remarked, and she gave me a small smile. "How are you feeling, Cass?" "Warm," I admitted, and then I gave her a tiny smile back. "But other than that, I guess I could be a lot worse." "That's exactly what I wanna hear," Marley replied as she walked over to the bed. Once she reached my side, she started checking my bandages. "It looks like your dressing stayed intact while you slept." "That's great." "Definitely," I agreed, and then I took another deep breath. "Marley, could we go to the pack house?" "In a while," Marley said slowly, and she offered me an apologetic look. "Let's get some food in you first, along with some water and another round of medicine, okay?" I sighed. She was right. "Okay," I agreed. Marley went downstairs for a while, and when she returned, she had a tray with a bowl of soup and some crackers, along with a cup of tea and a glass of water. I tried to feed myself, but Marley wouldn't let me. She insisted on helping me eat, and as embarrassing as it was to need help with such a normal thing, I knew it was in my best interest to accept the help. "You know, I've been thinking about it, Cassandra," Marley mused once I was done with my soup. "There has to be some way to reject the Alpha King's request." "I don't know about that, Marley," I objected. "His word is law." "Yeah, but you're the only fully qualified healer in this pack," she interrupted me with a raised eyebrow. "I mean, I'm no slouch, but I'm nowhere near as gifted as you, at least not yet. There's no way Gareth or Sophia would let you go. I'm sure they'll beg the Alpha King to let you stay. He'll change his mind, I'm sure of it." "I sure hope you're right," I said, and I smiled at her. Even though she could be grumpy sometimes, Marley managed to stay so optimistic even in times of hopelessness, and I admired her greatly. I only wished she was right. About an hour later, Marley helped me get out of bed, and after I changed my clothes and got myself a little more presentable, we decided it was time to go to the pack house. The walk there was unpleasant and slow, but Marley was there to help me the entire time, so it wasn't nearly as awful as it would have been alone. When we reached the pack house, Marley knocked on the door, and we were greeted by Jasper, who seemed surprised to see us. "Marley and Cassandra," he said slowly, and his dark eyebrows creased together. "What are you doing here?" "We're here to get Finnick," Marley explained, and she peeked around him into the entryway of the house. "Where are the Alpha and Luna?" "They're in the middle of a meeting with their guest," Jasper said cryptically. "Now isn't a great time." "I just want to see my son," I pleaded. "I'm sure he's more than ready to go home after everything he's been through." Jasper paused for a moment, and then his expression softened. "I'll need to report to the Alpha and Luna before you can take him," he said, and then he waved us forward. "Come on in." Marley grumbled under her breath, but I smiled at Jasper as we followed him inside. Once the doors were closed behind us, Jasper disappeared and left us in the entryway. "The Alpha King really has a way to bring out a weird side of people," Marley remarked. I don't think I've ever seen Jasper act so formal, especially with us. And since has he had to report our arrival? "It's probably just a formality," I said quietly. "Everyone has to be on their best behavior in front of the king." "I suppose," she said, and then she rolled her eyes. "Leave it to Jasper to be a suck-up." We giggled together for a minute until we heard footsteps from down the hall. "Shish," I murmured, and we gathered our composure. Luckily, it was just Jasper. "The Alpha and Luna wish to see you in the meeting room, Cassandra," he declared, and he waved me forward. Marley and I exchanged a glance. "I'll come with you," Marley said, but Jasper shook his head. "They want to see her alone," he replied, and Marley's green eyes darkened. "She's injured," she insisted, and her nostrils flared in frustration. "She needs help getting there." You can escort her to the door, but you must wait outside, Jasper sighed, and then he gestured toward the hallway. Let's go. We mustn't keep them waiting. We followed Jasper to the meeting room and stopped just outside the door. I'll be right out here for you, Marley assured me, and after I nodded, I carefully knocked on the door. Moments later, Gareth's voice called out to me. Come in. I gave Marley a nervous glance and then straightened my posture as much as my injured body would allow and entered the room. The Alpha's meeting room was one of the most spacious rooms in the entire pack house. The walls were painted a deep sapphire and the floors were a rich dark wood. Candles and lamps flickered around the room, and large, oversized couches were arranged around a coffee table. It was a beautifully decorated room, and for a moment, I was distracted by all of the pretty things. Gareth, Sophia, and Raiden were seated on the lengthiest couch while Asher Collins sat opposite them on an armchair. They all turned to stare at me as I entered, and Sophia jumped to her feet and raced over to me. Cassie, she exclaimed, and her eyes widened as she stared at my bandages. Thank the goddess, are you all right? I'm all right, I assured her, but the Luna didn't seem convinced. I've been so worried about you, she said, and she took my hands in hers. When I heard you'd been attacked by a bear, I was so scared for you. Thank you, I replied, and I gave her a warm smile. I'm doing much better now. Is that so? Asher called out, and a lump formed in my throat when he continued. You were in pretty bad shape when I found you. Even from across the room, I could see his eyes were colder than usual, and for a moment, I wanted to turn and run. But I couldn't. I needed to play this out correctly. Thank you, Your Majesty, I replied. For saving me, I mean. I'm feeling much better now than I was last night, and it's all thanks to you and Marley. Asher smirked, and then he tilted his head to the side. Tell me, Cassandra, he said slowly. Were you trying to run and get away from my order for you to come to Animond? I sure hope not, as it would make you a deserter. Chapter 13 King's Decision. Cassandra. My voice caught in my throat as the Alpha King's words set in. He was absolutely correct, and I understood the potential consequences of my actions completely. Things in Animond were different than they were here. In Animond, going against the Alpha's wish or running from the pack was considered treason, and furthermore, a felony. They were strict in their laws and highly set in their ways in the capital, something I knew all too well. I'd lived in that terrible city for 18 years. Asher Collins' cold gray eyes bore into mine with horrible intensity as he waited for me to respond to his accusation, but I didn't know how to answer. If I owned up to and admitted that I was trying to run away, I would be arrested and tried for treason. But I didn't have another reason to justify my actions. Who would run into the forest at midnight with all of their belongings other than a deserter? Luckily, before I could respond, Raiden rushed to his feet. You're taking her to Animond? He demanded in surprise, and his hands balled into a fist at his side. Alpha Gareth and Sophia's cheeks darkened at their eldest son's sudden outburst, and they looked at the Alpha King with apologetic expressions. Please forgive him, Your Majesty, Gareth pleaded, and his dark eyes shot daggers toward his son. Yes, please, Your Majesty, Sophia insisted, but Asher raised his hand to cut her off. Sophia closed her mouth and nodded, and then the Alpha King turned his attention to their son. Young Prince, have you learned nothing from your time with the Myriad? He asked in an amused yet irritated tone. Your father was just telling me that you received a Medal of Honor during your services. Was questioning your commander something you learned during your service? Raiden's eyes dropped to the floor and his hand released from its fist and relaxed. His expression said it all. He'd made a mistake in addressing the Alpha King directly like that, and he was in the wrong. After a moment, he looked Asher Collins in the eyes and straightened his posture. My apologies, Your Majesty, he said in an even tone. But you can't take Cassie away from us. Raiden. Gareth cut him off in a loud and surprised tone, and then he shook his head and turned to the Alpha King. I'm so sorry, Your Majesty. He then turned to his son. Leave us, he ordered, but Raiden's nostrils flared. Father, I have every right to remain here, he insisted, and even I was taken aback by the prince's declaration. Why was he sticking up for me so much and risking his fate? The Alpha King could have his head for his indignance, and yet Raiden didn't seem to care. Let him stay, Asher declared, and he raised his hand toward Farith. I wish to hear the young man out. He seems to have a very good reason for remaining in a decent case to make. So, please, Raiden, explain yourself. He fixed his steel gaze on Raiden and a lump formed in my throat. I was scared for Raiden. Asher Collins wasn't someone to challenge, and I was worried for his well-being. Raiden swallowed and then took a long, deep breath. His eyes seemed nervous, but his posture remained strong. Before I do, can we allow Cassandra to take a seat? He wondered, and he gestured toward me. She's still very much injured and I see that she's wavering a little. Yes, please, Your Majesty, Luna Sophia spoke up, and she offered me an apologetic glance. May she be seated? Asher considered her words for a moment, and for a second, I wondered if he would allow me to continue standing there in pain. It wouldn't be unlike him. But he simply nodded his head instead and gestured to the chair opposite him. Take a seat, Cassandra. Thank you, Your Majesty, I managed, but as soon as I took a step forward, I nearly fell. My entire body was still incredibly sore, and without Marley's assistance, I was semi-useless. Luckily, Alpha Gareth took notice and rushed over to me. Give me your arm, he said gently, and I nodded my head before allowing him to assist me. He guided me over to the chair, and once I was seated, he gave me a small smile and then returned to his perch on his sofa. The Alpha King waited for me to be situated, and then he turned back to Raiden. Please, continue, he urged. Raiden took another breath and then nodded. Cassandra is the only healer in our pack, Your Majesty, he began. We need her here. As my father mentioned to you earlier, an unknown illness has been spreading through the pack. Her patients need her in order to continue their treatments. Asher suddenly chuckled as if he were amused by something Raiden had said. His cold eyes darted over to me, and my heart nearly stopped. What's the name of your assistant? Marley, Your Majesty, I replied, and it took all of my effort to keep from stuttering. Marley Raven. Marley Raven, he repeated back. She's good at medical treatment, I assume, since you're still with us today. I nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. Marley has been training with me for a while now. She's a fast learner, and at this point in her studies, she's able to treat most common diseases and ailments without difficulties. But Cassie is better, Your Majesty, Raiden spoke up, and this time Asher Collins' stern face appeared annoyed at the outburst. Don't test my temper, young prince, he said, and he flashed Raiden a cold smile. Let me take a guess. You like this healer, don't you? That's why you don't wish for her to leave to Animont. It took everything to keep my jaw from dropping. What was Asher talking about? Was he purposely trying to embarrass me in front of the Wild Crawler's royal family? There was nothing between me and Raiden, so why else would the Alpha King say something to that effect? Raiden's cheeks flushed scarlet, and his lower lip trembled. Did I guess correctly? Asher laughed, and the sound made my blood run cold. His cruelty had only increased with time, and I could hardly recognize the man in front of me. When Raiden didn't answer, the Alpha King shook his head, and the smile left his face. Unfortunately, Prince Raiden, your Cassie is going to leave for Animond with me, he announced, and then his voice hardened further. There's no room for discussion. If you cooperate, I may send a few healers for your pack. Alpha Gareth and Luna Sophia's expressions appeared grateful. Thank you, Sophia began to say, but Asher raised his hand up to cut her off. His cold eyes remained on Raiden's, and he raised an eyebrow. But if you don't comply, he warned, and his lips curled into a snarl. I'm afraid your entire pack will suffer the consequences. I don't care how many people will die. She is coming with me. And that's that. Then, his eyes stared back at mine, and a chill ran down my spine. Chapter 14 Alpha's Mark. Cassandra. I felt like a rabbit cornered by a fearsome predatory. My entire body broke into goosebumps, and as I stared back at the Alpha King, I couldn't believe what was happening. Was this truly the Asher Collins I'd known since childhood? I'd always known the Alpha King was ruthless. I'd heard countless tales from others in the Wild Crawler pack about his heartlessness and his cruelty. It had been said on many occasions that he was much like his father, the old Alpha King, a man who'd centralized his power and oppressed the members of his own empire. At the time, I hadn't believed the stories. I'd thought there had to be some sort of disconnect, a misunderstanding of some sort that kept people from seeing the real Asher. He might not have been a loyal mate, but I'd always trusted that he would be a great alpha. Past memories flooded through my mind. Asher had never been a cold and dominant man all those years ago. We'd grown up together and spent most of our childhoods with one another. Even as a young boy, he'd been loving, caring and compassionate, and that had only continued into his teenage years. I remembered all of the times we'd sat together, discussing the future. He always told me that he wanted to be a kind alpha. He wanted to be nothing like his cruel father who'd never shown him an ounce of affection. Asher had sworn he wanted to release this corrupted empire from its old ways and usher in a time of peace and kindness. He valued all lives, poor and rich, and wanted to make sure the people of the empire knew that their well-being mattered to him. His father used to scold him for being a coward, but Asher had never wavered from his beliefs. And yet, as he stared at me now, he looked just as cold as his father, the former king. As much as my heart pleaded and hoped that Asher still had good in him, I knew I needed to accept that what others had said about his cruelty was true. The idea brought me a deep-rooted sadness, but I had to release those feelings if I was going to survive this ordeal. What could I do? Raiden, for whatever reason, had pleaded his case, but it had made no difference other than embarrassing the young prince in front of the Alpha King of Wegala. From Luna Sophia's saddened expression, I could tell she didn't want me to go either, and though Alpha Gareth's gaze was somewhere else, I knew deep down that he surely felt the same. I was valued in this pack, but their words and pleading didn't matter. I was going to Animond. I couldn't risk harm coming to the Wild Crawler pack. They had been too good to me to risk any lives. Asher finally turned away from me and fixed his gaze on Gareth. Will you, your wife, and the young prince please excuse us? He requested in a regal tone, and he lifted his chin. Cassandra and I need to have a private talk. Yes, of course, your majesty, Gareth said, and he nodded generously. He rose to his feet, and Sophia followed suit. She reached out and took Raiden's hand. Her son didn't seem like he wanted to leave the chamber, but soon, his face softened and he gave his mother a small nod. The Alpha King's orders couldn't be ignored, not when the lives of their pack mates were in danger. Your Majesty, will you please escort Cassandra to the door once she is finished? Sophia requested in a soft voice. Her assistant remains outside and will help her the rest of the way home, but... Yes, Asher replied coldly, but he offered the Luna a nod. I will see to it that your healer is assisted. Now please, leave us to speak alone. Sophia nodded again, and without another word, the Wild Crawler's royal family left the chamber. Once the door had closed behind them, my heart rate skyrocketed. What did he want to talk to me about? And why was it necessary to conduct the conversation in private? Was I in trouble? Asher Collins stared at me for a moment and then spoke. Alpha Gareth has informed me about the illness prevailing in your pack, Cassandra, he began in an even tone. One of the symptoms is black marks on the body, is that correct? I was taken aback by the question. I hadn't expected him to ask about the sickness, especially at a time like this, when my loyalty to the Empire was being questioned. But I nodded anyway. Yes, Your Majesty, I said. Asher nodded back slowly. What do you think it is? The marks, I asked, and after a brief pause, I continued. It's a strange symptom I'm not certain of. But lately I've been wondering if it's some kind of poison. A poison? Asher repeated back in surprise. Yes, Your Majesty, I replied, and I leaned in closer, ignoring the pain in my shoulder. There's a book my husband left me, all about the poisons he's dealt with in the past decade. I've combed through the book like mad, and each time, have noted a section that talks about something similar to this. Interesting, the Alpha King remarked. Please continue on, Cassandra. I nodded. Well, it says when werewolves were exposed to certain poisons, their blood would darken and continue to do so day by day. Blood marks would appear throughout their bodies. But that isn't the same as the disease that now prevails. Really? He replied, and somehow, he looked disappointed by this. How so? This one is more peculiar, I said. Similar marks are there in my patients, but they don't grow like the ones written about in the book. They don't resemble the shape of veins. In fact, they're more like tattoos. It's bizarre, Your Majesty. I've never seen anything like this illness. When I finished explaining, Asher fell silent and sat back in his seat. I could see him considering something, and after a minute or two, he leaned back forward and began to unbutton his white shirt from his collar. Heat spread through my body. What was happening? My entire face felt as if it were burning, and my hands shook at my sides. When he got 3 buttons down, he pulled the collar from his neck and exposed the skin beneath. My heart dropped. A large black mark spread from the area below his collarbone and appeared to continue downward. Shock set in and my jaw dropped. Yes, you're guessing correctly, he said plainly. It seems I have caught the very same disease that plagues your pack. My throat tightened as dread set in. This was unbelievable. My trusted healer in Anamon couldn't figure out the source of my affliction, the Alpha King revealed. He did all that he could, and yet he couldn't come even close to an answer. So, healer, I will need you to come with me to Anamon so you can find out the reason. Do you understand? Chapter 15. Don't get caught again. Cassandra. I gulped back the lump in my throat as I stared at the black mark on Asher's skin. Of anyone, I never would have expected the Alpha King to become infected with the mysterious disease. Especially since he'd just arrived here from Anamon. Was the disease running rampant in the capital just as it did here? We hadn't heard anything about it here, and besides, if it was so prevalent, there would have been no reason for Asher to keep his condition so private and concealed. So, how did he get infected in the first place? From the research I'd conducted with my patients, I'd come to the conclusion that the disease didn't transfer very easily, which was especially lucky for us. Otherwise, we'd all have been infected by now, especially me. I worked around the infected so often that it was a miracle that Marley and I hadn't become infected yet. Though the illness was peculiar and mysterious, there was one thing I did know: the disease weakened werewolves' power. Once present in the system, the disease latched onto the blood and caused the victims' bodies to deteriorate from the inside out. It was incredibly deadly and fast-acting, so it was only a matter of time before the patient died from the illness. No matter how much I didn't want to admit the feelings for Asher Collins that lingered in my heart, I still cared and worried for him. I didn't wish this disease on anyone, not even him. Your Majesty, I can treat you here, I proposed in a last-ditch effort to avoid Anamon. We have more samples here and it'll be better for me to continue my research where I have all of my prior records, devices, and books. I work better in a familiar environment. Well, in that case, I can move everything you need from here to Anamon, Asher countered. Even your little house. We can completely rebuild and replicate it in the capital with little difficulty. Part of me wanted to ask why he was so insistent on me returning with him to Anamon, but the other part knew I couldn't ask a question like that. The conversation wouldn't work well in my favor, and besides, Asher Collins probably just wanted everything under his absolute control, just like any king would. I exhaled quietly. There was nothing I could do to argue my case anymore. I had to go against my own desires and accept my fate. I was going to Anamon whether I liked it or not. There's no need to bring everything, I replied. Just my books, devices, and records would suffice. Good, Asher replied, and as he readjusted his shirt and buttoned the buttons back to the top, his mood seemed to brighten. I hated that he seemed so thrilled to have gotten his way, but there was nothing I could do about it. For now, I needed to focus on what I could control. Your Majesty, may I be excused? I asked as I straightened up in my seat. I'd like to return home before it gets too late. Go home. The Alpha King replied back in surprise, and then he shook his head. I'm afraid you won't be returning home, Cassandra. I've asked Alpha Gareth to prepare a room for you and your son. The belongings you left in the forest are in your room already, and a few guards have been sent to pick up the rest of your things. You won't need to return home for them. My eyes widened and my heart dropped at his statement. What was actually happening? Was I a prisoner here now? Was I actually being punished for my actions after all? But Marley is waiting for me, I blurted out before I could stop. Your assistant, Asher replied, and then he smirked and leaned forward to grab the cup of coffee that sat in front of him on the coffee table. He took his sweet time blowing on the steaming cup and then took a long, measured sip. Once he was done, he set the cup back down and looked back at me. Don't worry, she's already gone. She is? I asked, and the Alpha King nodded. I heard them out in the hall, he revealed. Alpha Gareth had her escorted out when he and his Luna left with their son. She's returned home. Oh, I remarked, and for a moment, I had to fight back my disappointment. I wanted to share all of the details of my encounter here with my friend and find comfort in her arms and words. You can say goodbye to her on the day of your departure, Asher said absently, and I froze in place. The day of my departure. I wouldn't be allowed to see my best friend until then. My chest heaved as I fought to keep myself calm. This was unfair on so many levels, and I could hardly contain my anger. If I was the girl I'd been so many years ago, I'd have leapt to my feet and demanded he let me leave. I would have put up a strong fight and insisted he let me stay here in the wild crawler pack. But I wasn't that girl anymore. She died in the inferno, and besides, Asher Collins wasn't the same boy he'd been back then. He was the Alpha King of Wegala now, and I had no choice but to obey his demands. So, I took a deep breath, collected myself, and raised my chin slightly. May I go to my room and see my son, Your Majesty? I requested formally. If he was going to hold me hostage, the least I could do was make sure my dear Finnick was okay. The poor kid was likely traumatized from our ordeal with the bear, and it was my duty to comfort him in these times of crisis. I expected Asher to put up more of a fight, but he nodded his head. Of course, he said, and then he gestured to the door. I'd expected him to keep me hostage in this chamber, but his expression had softened significantly. Despite his harshness, he seemed to have a soft spot for children, which I needed to use to my advantage as much as possible. Despite the pain that radiated through my shoulder, I rose from my seat and started to make my way across the chamber to the door. Every step was agony without an assistant to help me, but I managed to make it happen without tearing up. I couldn't let the Alpha King see me cry, not after everything I'd been through. I nearly made it to the door when Asher's voice spoke up from behind me. Cassandra, he said, and when I turned around his eyes had grown cold again. The next time you want to run, run wisely. Don't allow yourself to get caught. My heart sank down in my chest. For the briefest of moments, it felt like he was looking straight past my changed face and voice and was speaking to not Cassandra, but Cora Felix, the girl I'd been 5 years ago. Chapter 16, Cora's Story. Cassandra. I lingered outside the meeting room door for a moment, and my heart beat ferociously in my chest. Sure enough, Marley was gone, and I took this alone time to center myself. It had been a long time since I'd thought about the girl I'd been before the inferno. As the years had grown by, I'd allowed her to fade away into near nothingness, but the return of Asher Collins to my life had changed that entirely. Cassandra Keller, my new identity, was no match for the Alpha King, and his arrival, along with the order to return to Animond, had a chance of tearing my life to shreds. Long ago, I'd been Cora Felix, the daughter of a gamma wolf named Darren Felix. I had been born into a prestigious werewolf family, exalted in the Wegala Empire, and the Crescent Pack in particular. My father and my older brother, Hector, were well-respected warriors in our pack. They were tough as nails and a major asset to the crown. After a chain of events, I was chosen to be Asher the Alpha Prince's mate and the future Luna of the Empire. Life was perfect, wonderful even. That is, until it all fell apart. For reasons unknown, my father was framed and accused of committing crimes against the Lord Beta's family. It was claimed that my father wanted to steal the Beta's position, and as such, he was imprisoned for his alleged crimes. Meanwhile, my brother Hector was banished to be a guard at the impoverished border. I was taken prisoner as well, confined away, and left to die alone. It was well known throughout the Wegala Empire that Cora Felix had died in an inferno, Darren in prison, and Hector at the border. It was believed that the entire Felix family had been cursed by the moon goddess for their crimes against the crown. But it wasn't a curse. It was a plot. We'd all be set up. They'd wanted me to die alone. They'd forced a poison down my throat that had numbed my limbs and rendered me unable to move. They'd arranged the entire thing to make it seem as if it were an accident. Even to this day, I had no idea who the killers were. They had been wearing elaborate masks when they broke into my home and set the place ablaze. As they forced their concoction down my throat, They claimed they had been empowered by the moon goddess and were executing me out of loyalty to their new king. My life hadn't been the same since that fateful night, and I doubted it'd ever be the same again. I'd sworn many times over the years that I'd never return to Anamond again. But now, I had no choice. I had to follow the Alpha King's orders and treat the illness that plagued the wild crawler pack. I had to leave my entire life behind yet again and return to the place of my nightmares. I took a moment to breathe and then forced the memories out of my mind. I couldn't let myself drown in them, not when I had more important things looming on the horizon. Above all else, I had to keep my wits about me, since Anamond was a dangerous place full of dangerous werewolves. I would need to stay strong if I was going to keep myself and Finnick safe. Mrs. Keller. A voice interrupted my thoughts, and when I looked up, I noticed a young woman not much older than me, staring at me with a pleasant expression. She was very pretty, with long, curly chestnut brown hair and sky blue eyes. I'd seen her around the pack house before. She was a maid whose name I unfortunately couldn't remember. Yes, I asked. I'm here to escort you to your room, the maid said, and she gestured to the hallway beside us. Her voice was very kind, and she offered me a soft smile. What's your name? I asked her. Amalia. She introduced herself. Amalia, I repeated back and I smiled. That's a really beautiful name. Thank you so much, Mrs. Keller, Amalia replied, and her eyes glittered at the compliment. Alpha Gareth and Luna Sophia were far more gracious to their staff than the other royal families, so I knew she was treated quite well, but an extra ounce of compassion and niceness didn't hurt. Where is my room located? I wondered as I glanced around. My body ached so much, and I hoped I wouldn't have to walk too far throughout the pack house on my own. It's just past the lobby, Amalia said, and then she gestured forward. Shall we, Mrs. Keller? I nodded, and then I followed her down the hall. Each step was incredibly painful, but I managed to keep my face from betraying my anguish. Once we reached the lobby of the pack house, I spotted Jasper. His arms were crossed behind his back dutifully, but his dark eyes immediately met mine when I arrived. Will you excuse me for just a moment, Amalia? I asked the maid, and she offered me a small nod. I'll wait for you over there, she said, and after she glanced at Jasper, she walked to the other end of the entryway. Once she was gone, I approached Jasper. So, Marley left? I asked him, and his cheeks darkened significantly. Yes, he said quietly, and his hand reached up to brush his neck awkwardly. It was Alpha Gareth's order. I see, I remarked. I just wanted to make sure she was okay. She's fine, I promise you, he said sheepishly as if he were embarrassed by something. She didn't exactly want to go. She's stubborn, you know. But I managed to convince her to go home. When his hand moved away, I noticed the skin of his neck was red and raised, as if he'd been scratched. Marley. My best friend could be a little feral at times, and if his neck was any indication, she'd put up a fight on her way out. She wanted to say goodbye, Jasper admitted when he caught me looking at the scratches. We told her she had to go. That's Marley, I remarked. Sorry she did such a number on you. It's okay, he said. You're her best friend. She's protective of you. We fell into silence for a moment. Marley was incredibly strong, and I admired just how much she cared about me. If I'd been in her position, I'd have done the same. Except maybe the scratching part. I'm sorry, Cassandra, Jasper suddenly said. For a moment, I thought he was referring to the Marley situation, but his expression told me he was talking about my forthcoming departure. As a guard, he must have known what was going on. Don't be sorry, I said softly, and I offered him a small smile to show my appreciation. It's not your fault, Jasper. We smiled sadly at each other for a minute. There was so much I wanted to say, but I couldn't find the words. Mrs. Keller, Amalia called out and interrupted the moment. 1 minute, I called back, and then I looked at Jasper. See you later, okay. Have a good night, Cass, he replied. As I walked away toward Amalia, I couldn't help but feel sad. I would miss Marley and Jasper when I was in Anamond. Chapter 17 Healer's Fear. Asher. Once the healer left, I leaned back in the armchair in Alpha Gareth's meeting room and released a sigh. My head was aching, as if I had a million hammers pounding at it at once. I pinched the bridge of my nose between my fingers. It was difficult to say whether the headache was from the mysterious disease worsening or the lack of sleep. I barely got a full night's rest these days, and it was beginning to take its toll on my entire body. It was simply too difficult to rest when there was so much plaguing my mind. And now, there was someone else to consider, someone I couldn't get out of my head. Cassandra Keller. Even though she was gone, her name ran circles in my mind, over and over, as if it were a song rather than a name. Cassandra Keller, a nobody healer from a long-forgotten pack on the border of Wegala. Over the past few conversations I'd held with her, I knew there was something special about her, something weirdly familiar that drew me in unexplainable ways. As much as I wanted to dismiss those feelings, I knew they couldn't be ignored. Had I heard her name before? Or known someone with a similar one? Was her face similar to one I'd seen before? I couldn't place it anywhere in my memory, but perhaps she just reminded me of another subject. It was so hard to say. Either way, I couldn't figure it out. Deep down, I knew there was no need to bring the girl all the way to Anamond with me. My son was nearly healed from his encounter with the Viper and was going to make a full recovery. And she had been right, she could easily conduct her research here and report her findings to me in the capital city. But I wanted her to come with me. As much as I didn't want to admit it, I was immensely attracted to her. Her long, wavy copper hair that shimmered like flame, her beautiful dark green eyes, and her full lips. Even her petite, lovely figure drew me in. Since yesterday, I'd fantasized about the way her slender hips curved and how much I wanted to place my hands on them and draw her to me in an embrace. I hadn't been like this in years. In fact, I hadn't taken any interest in any woman after Cora had died. So, what was it about this woman that I couldn't get out of my head? Suddenly, a knock rang out and interrupted my thoughts. "Alpha," a voice then said, and I recognized it as Lancel, one of my guards. He'd been under my command for years and was one of the few I actually trusted. Despite being the king of the realm, there were few I could trust in Anamond. Everyone was conniving with ulterior motives and agendas that threatened to undermine my every move. But Lancel had been close to me for as long as I could remember. He had been my bodyguard since I was very young, and was the only one who still referred to me as Alpha, rather than Your Majesty, or King. "Come in, Lancel," I called out. Moments later, the door opened, and Lancel entered. He was an older man of nearly 50, with deep-set blue eyes, and hair that had turned prematurely white. He was broad and muscular and reminded me of a kinder version of my father. After he crossed the empty room, he stopped in front of me and bowed in respect. "Alpha, the healer's bags are all packed," he reported. I'd sent my guards to Cassandra Keller's house to pack her belongings while we spoke, so she wouldn't have a chance to escape again. "Did you happen to find anything suspicious?" I wondered, and I pinched my nose again as my head continued to pound. I closed my eyes again and leaned back into the chair. "There's a letter we found on the kitchen table," Lancel revealed. "It seems she left it with her assistant before she fled to the forest." "Really?" I asked, and my eyes flew open. "Have you read it?" I knew that it had to be suspicious if even Lancel found it curious. He nodded. "It seems that the healer was preparing to leave this pack for good. She planned to leave her clinic to her assistant, Marley Raven." "Marley," I repeated back. "I'm not surprised. But there's more, Alpha," Lancel continued slowly, and he lowered his voice slightly. "There's something I found very weird." I frowned. "Really?" "Yes," Lancel replied. "I may be reading into the matter, but I think she may be afraid of Anamond." "Afraid?" I repeated back. My trusted guard nodded. "Yes, Alpha." A laugh rose up from my chest. "Well, of course, she's afraid of Anamond, Lancel," I noted, and I rested back into the seat. "She's afraid she might struggle to take on the responsibilities I'm asking of her. Why else would she try to run away?" My logic felt foolproof, yet Lancel didn't seem too convinced. "Well, yes, Alpha," he said. "But that's not quite what I mean." "Then state your piece, Lancel," I urged, and I released a sigh. With my head pounding as severely as it was, I needed rest, and my guard was taking too long to reach his point. What was so suspicious about Cassandra Keller? Alpha. I've seen werewolves who have run away from their duties, Lancel said, and his deep blue eyes grew worried. They were nothing but cowards. But this healer, she doesn't seem like any of them. What makes you say that? I said, and my eyebrow raised. Lancel reached into the pocket of his trousers and retrieved a folder piece of paper. He unfurled it and then handed it to me. It's the last few sentences she wrote, he said, and then he gestured to the letter. I stared down at the flowy cursive writing and quickly read through the letter until I reached the bottom of the page. Please forgive me, Marley, I read aloud. I just can't go to Anamont. I have to run. I suddenly stopped, and my eyebrows creased together. I understood instantly what Lancel meant. She says, I can't go to Anamont, rather than, I don't want to, I mused. Why would she state it that way if she were truly trying to desert her duties? Alpha. I believe the woman to be very suspicious, Lancel said. From what I've inferred, it appears she's been to Anamon before. I fell silent as I stared at the letter in my hands. My trusted guard's words were likely true. The healer had been to Anamont. Something about her was strange, and the letter seemed to prove exactly what I'd been thinking. My head pounded even further. Something about this Cassandra Keller needed to be investigated, and it needed to be done at once. Keep an eye on her, Lancel, I ordered as I closed my eyes and gently rubbed my temples. If she is afraid of something in Anamont, we need to find out what it is. She's hiding something, and I intend to discover what it is. Chapter 18 Her Lost Necklace. Cassandra. Much to my excitement, when Amalia brought me to my intended room, Finnick was waiting for me on the other side of my door. His little face lit up with excitement, and his normally serious gray eyes widened as he grinned at me. Mommy! He exclaimed, and he rushed over to meet me. I'd half expected him to look a little rough around the edges after our encounter with the bear in the woods, but Finnick looked perfectly healthy. He threw his arms around me, and I fought back a sound of pain as he squeezed. Careful, baby, I said softly as tears welled in my eyes. I'm still a little sore. Oh. He realized, and he let go and took a step back. I'm sorry. Don't be, I assured him, and then I gave him a look over. Are you doing okay, sweetheart? I've been so worried about you. I'm better now, Mommy, he assured me, and he gave me a tiny smile. I was a little scared at first, but after I took a warm bath and got some new clothes, I was feeling better. Suddenly, a strange look crossed his face, and he noticed my bandages. Are you okay? He whispered, and he gently touched my arm. I'm okay, I assured him, and I carefully lowered myself down to his level. Can I tell you a secret? Finnick nodded. I was a little scared too, I admitted. But Marley patched me right up and gave me some medicine. I should be just fine in a little bit. I'm just going to need some rest and a lot of love from my favorite person. Me? Finnick asked excitedly, and when I nodded, his smile grew wider. You're my favorite person, too, he said. After we shared another careful hug, I rose to my feet, and Finnick gave me a tour of the room. It was incredibly spacious and painted a lovely deep green. The floors were a rich dark wood, and two canopied beds rested in the corner, just next to a floor-length window. The curtains were drawn, and the beautiful light of the sunset danced on the ground. My stomach rumbled a little. Are you hungry, Mommy? Finnick asked. A little, I admitted. Amalia cleared her throat. Alpha Gareth was inquiring if you'd like to join him for dinner. She asked, and I considered the request for a moment. Would it be all right if I ate here with my son? I asked. My body aches pretty badly, and I haven't seen him since last night. Of course, Amalia replied. The Alpha will be fine to accommodate you. I will bring you dinner here. Thank you, Amalia, I said. The maid smiled at me and then disappeared from the room. Once the door had closed behind her, I gestured to the pair of armchairs in the room. Finnick, can we talk? I asked. My son's eyebrows creased together and then he nodded. He followed me over to the chairs, and once we were seated, I took a deep breath. Honey, we're going to be going with the king to Anamont, I revealed. Finnick's eyes sparkled for a moment, but he managed to keep calm. Really? I nodded. Yes. We leave in a couple of days. Okay. He remarked simply. I could tell he was at least a little excited. Every child was curious about the capital of the werewolf empire. I'd often heard him and Dominic, Sophia's son, talking about it when they played. Finnick began to ask me all kinds of questions. He wanted to know all about it, what it looked like, how the people there lived, and what kind of clothing they wore so that he could blend in. He seemed so thrilled by the prospect of seeing a new city, and I didn't want to burst his bubble, so I answered him the best I could. After a while, Amalia returned with some food, and I was relieved to have a break from the questions. Above all else, I was glad Finnick hadn't asked me why I'd had a change of heart. He also hadn't brought up the Alpha King, and I was thrilled to skip that subject entirely. We ate quietly together, and then Finnick ran off to go play with Dominic before bed. I knew Finnick was probably bursting with excitement to tell his best friend all about going to Anamont, and admittedly, I was relieved to have a second to breathe. All of this talk of Anamont had me feeling stressed beyond belief, and I was still recovering from my injuries. I rose from my seat and decided to check the backpack I'd left behind in the woods. It was tucked in the corner of the room, and covered in mud. I was surprised they had gone to the effort of returning it to me. I sorted through the pack and double-checked to see if everything was there. All seemed to be in order. Except for one thing. I rifled through my things again, but it was definitely gone. I'd placed a moonstone pendant in the pocket of the backpack and sealed it tightly before we'd left for the forest. It had belonged to my late mother and was the only thing I had left of her. She had died when I was very young, and the pendant was the only keepsake I'd kept from my old life. It was a beautiful thing, white gold, with a shimmering silver stone ringed by tiny white diamonds. It was small, but not too small, and the most gorgeous thing I owned. It was the kind of necklace worn by someone of high rank, as I'd been before the Inferno. It had been gifted to my mother by her mother, and I'd intended to pass it along to my children one day just as they had. Emmett had told me to get rid of the necklace years ago. He'd told me the pendant was a liability and that if it was discovered, my identity could be as well. I understood what my husband had meant, but I couldn't get rid of it. It was the only thing my mother had left me, and the only thing I hadn't lost in the fire. And now it was nowhere to be found. Panic began to set in. Had it fallen out of my backpack during my fight with the bear? Perhaps in the fight, he'd scratched at the pack and it had fallen out. For a moment, that seemed like the correct answer, but there were no scratch marks, and the pocket had been completely sealed. So, where had it gone? I thought about it for a while. Had my mind deceived me? Had I actually forgotten to pack it in the first place? Maybe with everything going on, I'd meant to pack it but actually forgot it at my house. Then it dawned on me. A realization crashed over me, and my hands began to shake. Asher Collins had sent his guards to pick up the rest of my belongings. My chest heaved as I fought to catch my breath. If he or his guards found the necklace, it could mean the end of my life, as well as Finnick's. Chapter 19 Mommy said you're bad. Asher. I stared out the window and admired the way the light entered the room. Dusk here in the wild crawler pack was far more tranquil here than it was all the way out in Anamont. Out in the capital, it was nearly impossible to see the horizon amidst the tall buildings and structures. Here, there was nothing but open sky for miles. I peered out at the front lawns. Here, the grass grew tall and was a plush, emerald green. The lawns of my palace in Anamont were nothing like this. They were broad and spacious but cut meticulously short by the team of gardeners. It was almost as if wildlife was forbidden. There was no smell of pine, no fresh air. I inhaled deeply. I'd never admit it to anyone, but I would miss the fresh air here. There was something to be said for this land beside the border. There was a wildness here that didn't exist out in Anamont, no matter how much I yearned for it. Far out on the lawn, two boys were playing ball with one another. One of them, I assumed, was the son of the Alpha, and the other I recognized as Cassandra Keller's son, the one with the gray eyes named Finnick. Finnick Keller. As I watched the two play, I considered the strange color of the boy's eyes. In the past, it was said that the color of the iris was a royal trait, passed down from an ancient bloodline. However, I had a few acquaintances who had similarly colored eyes, so that wasn't exactly true. The strange part was the way Cassandra had acted when her son pointed out that I shared the same color eyes. The beautiful healer seemed scared, panicked almost, when the boy had spoken up. Why was she so afraid of me? I knew I could be intimidating, but was there something more that I didn't know? I studied Finnick. The sweet boy was laughing with his friend, and the musical sound made me smile. The pair looked so happy and innocent, and for a moment, my heart ached. When I was a child, I'd had similar times with my own friends. We'd spent countless hours playing ball, exploring the castle, and reenacting plays we concocted in our minds. My best friends back then had been Cora and her older brother Hector. We were practically inseparable and spent all of our time with one another. We grew up together, and as the years flew by, I found myself becoming more and more enamored with Cora. Falling in love with her came naturally, and when we found out we were mates, that love only grew stronger. Those memories felt so far away now. I was no longer the little boy who played ball. I was the Alpha King of the Wegala Empire, a ruthless leader who didn't have time to play or enjoy myself. And Cora was gone. My thoughts were interrupted when a servant appeared on the lawn. He approached Finnick and the Alpha's son and began to speak with them. Their conversation carried on for a while, and I watched the Alpha's son sigh in dejection. The servant soon left, and the boy followed suit. Finnick was left on the lawn alone, and even from the vantage of my room, I could tell the boy was sad. Just like me, I thought. Cora and Hector had left me too, and I was all alone with nothing but my power and my enemies. Suddenly, a knock was heard behind me. I turned around and released a sigh. "Who is it?" I asked, and I straightened myself up. "A servant of Alpha Gareth's, Your Majesty," a young man's voice replied. "May I enter the room?" "You may," I agreed reluctantly, and before the door opened, I took a breath. I needed to push away all thoughts of Hector and Cora. I had more important things to worry about at the moment. The door opened, and a servant appeared. He was no older than I, and his hazel eyes were timid as they flashed over to me. I recognized him but hadn't bothered to learn his name since I'd been here. "Dinner is ready, Your Majesty," the servant announced, and he offered me a small bow. "Thank you for letting me know," I replied, and I fought away the boredom. Yet another dinner with yet another Alpha. Gareth and his wife Sophia had been wonderful hosts, but I was tired of having business conversations. They were often so dull, and it was difficult to speak my mind when I knew my hosts were terrified of my presence. But I had a part to play. If I showed weakness, my authority could be questioned. I was the Alpha King and I needed to conduct myself as such. "May I escort you to the lobby, Your Majesty?" the servant asked timidly. I noticed his hands shook at his sides, and for a moment, I wanted to tell him I could easily walk to the lobby myself, but I knew that I needed to have measures in place to ensure my safety. My own guards were in a meeting at the moment, and it was unlikely that this young man would bring me any harm on his own. "Yes, you may," I said. I approached the mirror by the dresser and ran my hands through my dark hair. My eyes were underscored by deep dark circles, but there was nothing to be done there. I was as presentable as I could be. I followed the servant out the door and down the hall. As we walked down the stairs and toward the lobby, I passed by a handful of Gareth's pack, and each offered various words of politeness. I did my duty and acknowledged them, but it felt like a chore. While I would miss the fresh air, I was ready to be back in my own home and in my own chambers. When we reached the lobby, I was surprised to see young Finnick was there. The boy was staring at a point beyond him, and when I followed his gaze, I realized he was watching his friend being escorted toward the dining room. I considered my move and decided to approach the boy. "Would you care to join us?" I asked him directly, and Finnick jumped. Before I could get another word in, the boy retreated slowly, as if I were some sort of predator closing in on its prey. "Mommy and I already ate earlier," he said cautiously. "He told the Alpha we wouldn't join him." "Is that so?" I replied, amused, and then I grinned at him. "You can join us anyway if you want. I can tell your mother it's okay." Finnick blinked his wide gray eyes at me and considered my words. He studied me with his serious gaze for a moment or two and then shook his head. "No, Your Majesty," he said like a little adult. "Mommy said you're very bad." Before I could utter my disbelief, the boy bowed and then took off down the hall, leaving me confused and disappointed. Chapter 20 Alpha's Dinner. Asher. After the boy disappeared, I released a sigh and then followed Gareth's servant into the dining room. I wished that Finnick had joined us and explained what he meant by his words. Had Cassandra Keller really told him that I was a bad man? The idea should have enraged me, and yet, I was somewhat amused. I didn't love the idea of a child fearing me, but perhaps he'd simply twisted her words as children so often did. Either way, something about the Kellers was intriguing, and I looked forward to getting to know them once we reached Anamont. Upon my arrival, Alpha Gareth and Luna Sophia, along with their son, rose to their feet and offered me solemn bows. I inclined my head in their direction respectfully and then turned my attention back to the servant leading me through the room. A long, rectangular table sat at the center of the wood-floored room, and around us, the light from the enormous red brick fireplace flickered. The room itself was painted a rich dark red, and a smile formed on my lips. Despite this pack existing at the border of the empire, the furnishings were exquisite and worthy of royalty. There was a hominess here that didn't exist in my palace. The servant offered me the seat at the head of the table, and once I sat, he pushed the chair in for me and then gave me a small bow. "Please let me know if there's anything else you require, Your Majesty," he said. When I waved my hand, he nodded once in understanding and then disappeared. Gareth's servants were quite attentive, I'd give them that. Once he was gone, I returned my attention to the table. The Alpha and Luna bowed their heads in respect once again, and then Gareth cleared his throat. "Good evening, Your Majesty," he said, and he offered me a pleasant expression. "I take it you're feeling better." "Marginally," I replied politely. "Thank you for your concern." Gareth nodded. "If there's anything else we can do, please don't hesitate to ask." "I'll keep that in mind," I replied, and then my eyes flicked over to my right. I hadn't realized my son, Prince Marco, was seated there. The boy's eyes were brighter than they'd been before, and color had returned to his cheeks. "Hello, Daddy," he greeted me with a smile, and I smiled back. "Hello, my son," I replied. "You're looking better. Whatever the healer did to treat you, it appears to be working." "I feel better, Daddy," Marco declared. When the Viper had struck, I'd been terrified of losing the boy, but Cassandra Keller's methods had apparently worked perfectly. How was it that a healer from a small pack such as this was so knowledgeable when it came to illnesses? I could only hope she'd be able to treat my disease as well. Servants entered the room bearing trays of food, and instantly, the air around us filled with pleasant scents. They laid down platters of chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and freshly baked bread on the long table, and then began to dole portions out onto the china before us. Once our plates were full to the brim, the servants bowed at Alpha Gareth first, and then myself and Prince Marco. "That will be all," Gareth said, and then the servants bowed again and left the chamber. We then began to eat, and the moment I took a large bite, I felt the lingering remains of my poor mood slip away. Between the deliciousness of the food and witnessing the childhood innocence out on the lawn earlier, I was feeling better than I had in a long time. Marco seemed to pick up on that straight away. "Daddy, why are you so happy?" he wondered with a slight tilt of his head, and then he took a bite of his mashed potatoes. I smiled again at my son. "No reason," I remarked, and then I reached over and patted him on the shoulder. Marco smiled at me, content with the affection. Marco was quite needy for my attention these days. When I'd planned this trip down to the wild crawler pack, I'd intended to come alone with only Lancel, but Marco had insisted on joining me. I'd put up a little bit of a fight, but at the end of the day, I couldn't deny him. Any 5-year-old child would have done the same, and I couldn't blame him for wanting to stay by my side. "It's such a blessing that Prince Marco has recovered so quickly, Your Majesty," Gareth spoke up. "It's all thanks to your healer," I remarked as I turned my attention to him. "She's quite remarkable, isn't she?" Gareth's cheeks darkened slightly, but he simply nodded his head. "Indeed, she is." He appeared slightly awkward at the mention of Cassandra, and part of me wondered if it was because I was taking her with me to Anamont. "I haven't seen your eldest son, Alpha," I mused. "Where is he? Is he still unhappy with my decision to bring the healer with me?" "No, Your Majesty," Gareth insisted, and then he gulped. "I beg your forgiveness on his behalf. He isn't feeling well." "Oh, I cut him off. I figured the young man was angry with me. It's rather obvious he's smitten with her. Of course, you already knew that. Gareth and Sophia's eyes widened and flew to each other. I watched with amusement as their cheeks flushed scarlet. What does smitten mean? Their son, Dominic, spoke up quietly, and when he tugged on his father's sleeve, Gareth sighed. Eat your food, Dominic, he insisted, and then he turned his attention back to me. Your Majesty, I think you're mistaken about Raiden. Cassandra Keller arrived here 5 years ago when Raiden was just about to join the Myriad. He was too preoccupied with his service to notice her, and besides, she was married back then. They've barely interacted since. My brow lifted. She came to your pack 5 years ago? I asked. I thought she was born here. Curious. How is that possible, Alpha? Does your pack accept rogues? Absolutely not, Gareth replied quickly. She came to our pack with our old healer, Emmett. He brought her here and married her, so we accepted her as our own. We would never go against the rules of Wegala. His voice wavered, and I fought the urge to fire back. Relax, Alpha Gareth, I said casually, and I raised my hand up. I was just making a guess. Marriage. Huh, so where did she come from? We don't know, Your Majesty, Gareth admitted. Emmett said she was a stray. Back then, she had scars all over her body and she appeared to have been through an ordeal. His voice trailed off and his lower lip trembled. Stray. Stray was just a mild word for rogue. Gareth was right to look terrified. Accepting werewolves into a pack without a clear background was a serious offense. If they'd admitted a stray all those years ago, it was clear this remote pack was just as careless as I'd initially assumed. Before I could open my mouth to speak, the chamber door opened and Lancel walked in. The expression on his face told me the matter was serious. I have something to report to you, Alpha, he announced, and then his eyes fell to Gareth. Speak it, I replied shortly. Lancel straightened his posture before he spoke. A servant said he saw the healer and Alpha Gareth's son sneak out of the pack house just a few minutes ago. They're gone.